in 1965, and the deal was that Ford would take over the whole team, but Ferrari would be allowed to do the racing organization, and they were ready to have sign a deal when Ford met with the American lawyers, and as you might expect, that ruined the deal. Ferrari threw them out, and Ford got upset. Now, I heard another story. Since there are ladies here, we might as well make it a little human interest. The other story that I heard from a guy who was actually on the team at that time was Ford made a lot of trips. Henry Ford Jr. we're talking about. Of course, when I said Ford, I meant Henry Ford Jr. He made a lot of trips to Italy to do this deal. And there was a certain woman who ultimately became Christina Ford in Italy. And that was apparently more of a motivating factor for him to want to do the deal than with Ford. So you can leave that as you will, but that's the second story that goes with that acquisition. Well, apparently at that time, Henry Ford Jr. got really upset, and he said, beat Ford, no expense spared, and they were flush with money. Problem is, we didn't have any ability to race at Le Mans, which was his goal. Now think about it. You will see inside when you do the tour that we went to Le Mans once when it was an open wheel race. In 1921, they took 3 Duesenbergs over, and Jimmy Murphy won with the famous Duesenberg, and that's a great race. I mean, I don't like to get too far back in history, but I think we all have to learn that the cars didn't start with a 1965 Mustang. They started way early. And in 1921, we actually won a race overseas. The only race that America won overseas, despite the fact that they had Targa Florios and Mille Miglias and Le Mans and Brooklands and all that, the only race we won was 1921 until 1966 with the sister car to this. So we didn't have any racing technology here. The best he could do was to go to Lola, and he implored Eric Broadley to make him a race car, which as a prototype only had to have a Ford engine in it. So they already had a big Galaxy big block Ford engine, and they had the 289 small block engines. They started with the Mark I's and were very, very unsuccessful in 1965. I don't think any of them finished. Did any of them finish?
No. I
don't think any finished. They were very unsuccessful, but they were the 289s. So the next year, they put in a 427, and there were a lot of things done. In fact, Greg, you know that SAE paper, phenomenal thing. The Society of Automotive Engineers rarely would do a whole, I wouldn't even say a monograph. It's like almost like a book on an individual car, because everything about the Mark II was interesting. The flywheel, the aluminum water pump, the special built T44 transaxle, the aluminum heads, the special manifolding. They started off with Weber's and then they went to Holley's, and then the suspension was special. And all this stuff like cooling ducts for the brakes and all, and ground effects. All this was really special, and a lot of that was mentioned in the SAE paper. So it was a really very, very special car. But it was designed basically in England, and they put a Ford engine in it, and they went to Le Mans, and they were so far ahead that they basically won 1, 2, 3, all with Mark IIs. This car was driven by Frank Gardner, and he really did okay, but I think he dropped out with a bad clutch around 8 hours. It certainly didn't finish, but it still was very credible. Well, then the motoring press said, you know what? Yeah, I mean, Ford won it, but really it's a British car with a Ford engine. You know, why don't you make a car in America? And that's how they started Carcraft. Now, Carcraft was in Michigan, right? So they started their own racing company called Carcraft in Michigan, and they even took the Mark II design and they made it even more different. Here you have the Mark IV, which you can see substantially different, only a year apart. Has basically the same engine, basically the force-fed, oil-cooled T44 transmission, but a radically different design. The neatest thing to me about this design was, in order to make a light chassis and a light monocoque, instead of using steel, they took 2 sheets of aluminum, and then in between the 2 sheets of aluminum, they put a honeycombed spacer which had, of course, structural rigidity, and they epoxied that all together. And I understand that for thickness, that had the same tensile stress and resistance to bending as steel, pretty much. Isn't that right? And then there were a few other things. Of course, they had the gas bladders in the side, and there's just so much different stuff about this. You can see the streamlining is really beautiful. And again, in 1967, they went back and they won with this car, not this one, with Gurney and Foyt driving. Now here you have an American-made car with American drivers, twice between 1921 and 1967. When all through Europe, I mean, Le Mans was the Olympics. You were one of Le Mans. You were Michael Jordan. Your car was the best car. You could go out and sell cars. But here, we just, for some reason, didn't want to do Le Mans. And of course, after that, they have changed the rules so that these cars were no longer eligible because of their displacement size. And despite that, the 289s were still eligible. And under John Wyer and Gulf, we won again in 1968 and 69, actually with the same car. And then Porsche came out with that beautiful 917 that you'll see inside. That car came in second, by the way, in 1970, and Ford was out of it. So what you're looking at really is an evolution of design that was stimulated by anger with Enzo Ferrari, and also by really the ultimate in sports car design at the time. However, I must say, if you look at this car, and then you look at the car which is basically 2 years ahead of it, the Porsche 917, there's even another big increment, a gigantic increment. This, by the way, is where we stop collecting, I mean personally, because any cars later than this, and that includes the 917, are almost impossible to drive. So they become pieces of sculpture, which isn't fair. A collector should be able to at least do this. We had the 917 out here, and you can't get it out of first. I think the shifting point to second's around 60 miles an hour, so they become impractical. Kev, you want to?
Keep up with this thing.
Loosen it up so it goes.
No, it's all